So when I started the study, I felt that in many respects, politics proceeded as usual. And I wasn't that optimistic that I would be able to put my finger on what really changed. But my conclusion was, after several years of looking at different cases in different countries and really going back in time, starting with the telegraph technology up to social media, is that the exception when technology does change politics is when the technology expands opportunities for people to connect with each other. And if, when they connect with people that they wouldn't have otherwise connected with, if they have the opportunity to build trust with each other, then there's the foundation for possible collective action. And then with the possibility of collective action, there's the possibility of new politics. So from my perspective, there are many, many steps, many hurdles that a group of people have to really to surmount in order to really produce what you could call a new politics that's really a result of the technology. And I call these new groups that are where people are connected primarily by technology and have enough trust with each other to work together politically. I call them trust communities. And that's what you see in the title of the book. So to put these trust communities in context, let me bookend them with networks on one side and institutions on the other. So I'm a political scientist. On the networks, I think of networks as just people who know each other, but not necessarily know each other well enough to work together. So people who are on an email list, maybe they all shop at the same store, or maybe they're fans of the same movie star. So that's one kind of network. Or even sometimes a network like LinkedIn, where you just know a lot of colleagues in different places, but you wouldn't necessarily work with them intensely on any particular project. So we have networks on one end, and on the other end, we have institutions. And in political science, we think of institutions as very formal organizations. So institutions have membership lists. They often have membership fees. There's definitely someone in charge. There are rules, and when the institution is going to do something, there's a procedure. And so institutions are the kinds of organizations in society that actually get things done. They can move political issues forward. But I think if we want to understand the effect of technology in politics, we have to look at that middle area between networks and institutions. So those trust communities that may or may not be hierarchical, where it may or may not be clear who the leader is, where there's very loose rules about who is a member or who is not, and maybe there's a lot of flexibility there. So before I go too far, one thing that I mentioned earlier is collective action. And collective action is something that we're very interested in political science. And basically, you have a collective action problem when if most people would benefit if they work together, but that shared benefit would be lost if most people chose to free ride instead. So the challenge is, in some political situations, is to persuade people to look past their own self-interest, which in many cases is just being lazy and doing nothing, to work for the common good. So that's the kind of context in which I'm trying to see if trust communities do have enough social capital to take collective action. The book has about 20 historical case studies from all parts of the world, and they are in two sets. One set looks at how activists use technology for their political action, and the other set is a set of cases from how government use technology to extend their influence. And I don't have very much time today, so I'm just going to look at one or two from each set. So I'll start with a historical case on the activist side from 1900. I don't think probably anybody at this conference has discussed anything as old as 1900. But in 1900 in China, the Empress Dowager Cixi placed under house arrest Emperor Guangxi, leader of the 100 Days Reform. And Emperor Guangxi was calling for major changes in the Chinese government. He really called for modern fields of study to be introduced instead of just the classical literary training that had been used to train government officials. So people in civil society who wanted to support Emperor Guangxi in the modernization of the Chinese government tried to create pressure on the Empress Dowager not to remove Emperor Guangxi entirely. And one of the leaders in this was Jin Yuanshan, who was chief of the Shanghai Telegraph Administration. And what he did is he sent public telegrams to newspapers around China and around the world, which in turn triggered telegrams in support of the emperor from within China and abroad. And these telegrams, one of which was signed by over 1,200 people, would be published in the newspapers and would appeal to the Empress Dowager not to remove Emperor Guangxi. So in the end, Empress Dowager Cixi was not able to further harm Emperor Guangxi. However, the activist, Jin Yuanshan, did have to flee. He left for Macau and was released later, about a year and a half. Now, Jin Yuanshan is a very interesting character. He was a very successful businessman. In a period when the Qing court was really trying to constrain the use of the telegraph, he ran the Shanghai Telegraph Administration. He lengthened service hours. He dropped the price of telegrams and had a very profitable business. On the political side, Jin Yuanshan, this public telegram campaign in support of Emperor Guangxi was not the first time he had run a public telegram campaign. He had run several, many of which had failed, but this one in particular was successful, and he got people from different parts of China, from Shanghai, Guangdong, Hangzhou, and also from Southeast Asia, from Japan, and the US to participate. So this is an example of the newest technology at the time in 1900, in the telegram in 1900, used to create a trust community for political action in China. Time is short today, so I'm going to move to some generalizations from this. If you are interested, there are more cases in the book. So when I looked at the activist cases, about 10 cases in different countries, I drew a few conclusions. First of all, that activists tend to use not just one technology. They might use the newest thing at the time, like the telegraph, but they would also use older technologies, in this case, like the newspaper. I also observed that commerce plays a big role. So for activists to really reach a broad community, they had to use a product or a service that was widely available. And that's generally something that's commercially quite successful and popular. Also, these activists rarely succeeded the first time around. So they had to practice using a combination of different technologies and developing relationships with people in their networks, really to develop the social capital to take this collective action. Looking at this from a more social science perspective, I found the contributions of Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom very useful. And this is something that might be more directly applicable to your work in cybersecurity and identity and trust. She and her colleagues demonstrated through their empirical instruments that communication substantially increases cooperation in many types of social dilemmas, especially when there's no external enforcer. So we're looking at situations where people would benefit if they work together, but there's no one there to force them to do it. She has a large body of work, but to sum up in about 10 seconds, what does communication contribute to this cooperation? First of all, it allows people to discuss optimal strategy, exchange promises, increase mutual trust, which affects expectations, reinforce normative rules, and develop a group identity. And the result of this communication, more frequent communication, means people are more likely to cooperate. All this reciprocity builds trust, and past cooperation leads people to expect cooperation in the future. And you'll notice this whole discussion is a tale of building cooperation over time and over multiple interactions. And not necessarily with an authority figure. So that's what this body of work, the direction of this body of work. Now I'm going to turn to an example from the government side. I'll talk about Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a public broadcaster of Qatar. It's linked to another example I don't have much time to talk about today, the BBC. In fact, Al Jazeera in its early days hired many reporters away from the BBC. to work at Al Jazeera. Qatar's launch of this news network remade the country's image in the Middle East and in the world. Prior to the launch of Al Jazeera, many of you will remember that the Middle East lacked an Arabic news service from the region that provided news without a very strong slant from the government, the home country's broadcaster. Qatar's government launched Al Jazeera as part of a larger effort to raise its profile in the world. So in the 1990s, its leaders took action to distinguish Qatar from other Gulf states. It attracted leading international universities to establish campuses in Doha. It started to host international events like the World Trade Organization meetings to sports events. And it's in this context of Qatar raising its foreign policy profile that Al Jazeera was launched. So when Al Jazeera began in 1996, many of its peer state-run news agencies really waited for government instruction before broadcasting, and Al Jazeera challenged that custom and started introducing real-time news coverage. So in 2003, when the US and Allied forces attacked Baghdad, for example, Al Jazeera was the only Arab network broadcasting live from the scene. Some critics of Al Jazeera say that it does face constraints at home in its coverage. For example, maybe it does not report on power struggles within Qatar as much as it does in countries elsewhere. I have a note from looking at the history of the BBC that Winston Churchill, before he was prime minister, couldn't get his speeches onto the BBC. So the BBC's independence is very famous, but it's a very hard-earned reputation over time. And Al Jazeera still is in its early days, I think. So Al Jazeera really has built, from this government institution perspective, a very powerful trust community over the last 2 decades. And as our colleague just mentioned earlier, in 2011, when revolutions broke out across the Middle East, Al Jazeera played a very pivotal role. In fact, it collected videos and news posted to social media by the public, and especially where its own reporters were banned, Al Jazeera redistributed this information. So very much the same method that Jin Yuanshan used with public telegrams in 1900 in China. So what's the usefulness of the idea of trust communities? When we think of how society works, we tend to try to group people into different categories to try to understand what their political interests are and what the dynamics are in society. One way, a very traditional way of grouping people in society is by estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. That's sort of when you study the history of political science, you kind of begin there in European history. Another type of categorization is by guilds. So Adam Smith would talk about these guilds in terms of the economic organization of society, all silversmiths together, all textile producers together, and that would be very hierarchical so that the master and the apprentice are all in the same group. In contrast, Karl Marx, instead of looking at society vertically, looked at society horizontally, primarily between the capitalists who owned the means of production and the proletariat or the workers who worked in the factories at this time of industrialization when he was doing his research. And that, of course, is involved today to our understanding of socioeconomic class, where we distinguish people by level of income and type of work and use that to predict their political views. So just as class is an analytical tool that enables us to connect the individual with the larger economy and politics, so I think trust communities gives us a tool to understand how individuals connect in a world of changing information and ideas. So these trust communities are not just the physical networks of infrastructure, but the networks of people connected by technology, held together by common idea, reciprocating information and ideas that can potentially cooperate for political ends. At dinner yesterday, I asked some of you what you had learned in the conference yesterday, and I heard a little bit of the discussion this morning. In terms of the applicability of this work for cybersecurity and for identity and trust, I think what I would say is that in building trust for any particular end, the process of participation, of including people in arriving at norms is very important. And I know from my experience working in the regulatory arena, for example, in electromagnetic safety, there are standards that are used for safety where you have third-party organizations that at a national level will approve different kinds of equipment. And when I was engaged in such an activity 10, 15 years ago, I remember that the introduction of these norms in APEC, in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, was not simply a matter of stating what the standards were, but meeting after meeting, I would say at least 5 years worth of meetings twice yearly of the engineers and the technical experts who were engaged to just get to know each other and feel comfortable with each other's professional standards, and really developing a network of organizations and institutions and individual experts that led each national authority to feel comfortable that they could trust another national authority to properly certify their third-party organizations. And I observed that this took quite a long time. And so I imagine that in this arena, a similar process might be necessary.